Welcome. My name is Christina Davis. I'm the director of the program on U.S.-Japan relations. I'm very happy to have you join us today for a panel on investment screening and supply chain security, Japanese, EU, and U.S. perspectives on China. We all know from recent years the trade war and the pandemic have demonstrated how our global economy has deep interdependence that is subject to disruption. And as we're made aware about the vulnerability of global value chains where we can get anything we want from somewhere across the world, we're starting to question if this interdependence has too many risks. And there's also concerns as there's growing rivalries among nations about whether complete interdependence for everything from semiconductors to medicine supply is actually in the national interest. And so governments are increasingly paying attention to whether there's a need for decoupling to disrupt these supply chains, especially when it comes to the question of investment. Will we have efforts to screen investment? These are really important questions. And today we're bringing to you a panel of the leading experts. And so we're going to have short 12-minute presentations by 3 scholars, followed by a time for question and answer. So let me first introduce our speakers. First, we will have Kristin Vekasi, who is a current associate with the program on U.S.-Japan relations, and is also the associate professor of political science at the University of Maine. Her book, just recently published, Risk Management Strategies of Japanese Companies in China, Political Crisis and Multinational Firms, has been published by Rutledge University. It's an amazing story about global diplomacy of firms and how they deal with political tensions created by governments, politics, that can make it more complicated to be an international business, especially a Japanese firm doing business in China. She's going to share with us her ideas about supply chain security from the Japanese perspective. Our second speaker, Sophie Meunier, is senior research scholar at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, where she's the co-director of the European Union program. I was actually very privileged to be at Princeton when she was awarded the Chevalier d'Ordre de Palme Academy. I think I mispronounced that terribly, but it is a very high honor from the French government that was given to her as a cultural representative of significance for the French government. She's the author of many prominent books, from Trading Voices, the European Union and International Commercial Negotiations, and also many leading articles. Today, we get to hear about one of her recent articles, co-authored with Zenobia Chan, which is called Behind the Screen: Understanding National Support for Foreign Investment Screening Mechanism in the European Union. She's been doing much exciting work about how Chinese investment has impacted Europe and the many creative responses that we're seeing in the European Union. Our third speaker, Sarah Bauerle-Danzman, is Assistant Professor of International Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. She has a book that came out in 2019, Merging Interests: When Domestic Firms Shape FDI, that really looks at the complicated choices about when do domestic companies choose to welcome foreign investment. And she explores this looking at both political actors and firm interests that shape foreign direct investment. She's also been a fellow with the Council of Foreign Relations, and today we're going to hear her presentation on investment screening, supply chain security, the US perspective. Now, these 3 scholars are really leading experts, but they're also impressive outside of the research room. Both Sophie and Kristin are accomplished gardeners. I can vouch that Sophie is well known in Princeton as having the most beautiful garden, and she's also a chef who makes the best pies possible. Kristin has actually got an apple orchard up in Maine, and not to be left behind, Sarah, actually not making gardens, is a long distance runner who's training to run a 100K race. So not only will they help us to understand foreign investment, but I welcome you to get to know them as great individuals. Thanks so much. I want to forecast our next presentation for the week ahead, where we're going to look at cybersecurity and the future of US-Japan relations with a presentation by Mihoko Matsubara, who is cybersecurity strategist with NTT. Let me remind you, please keep your microphone muted and raise the hand or ask a question in chat after our presentations have completed. Without any further delay, let's go forward and have our first presentation.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction and for having me here today. And particularly thank you to the organizers and the staff, particularly Drs. Christina Davis and Shinju Fujihira. I'm fortunate enough to be spending this year at the US-Japan program. I'm starting work on my next book on Japanese and Chinese cooperation and competition in supply chain security in the Indo-Pacific. So today I'm going to talk about Japanese supply chain security strategies. And I really have three big things that I'd like you to take away or perhaps question from my presentation. First, that concerns about supply chain security are one of really important pillar of growing multilateral cooperation between Japan and Japan's allies, particularly the United States, but also Australia, perhaps the Quad, the European Union. However, discussions about supply chain security, right? What are we talking about when we say supply chain security or supply chain resilience differ between Japan and the United States, but they also differ between private companies and the governments that talk about supply chain security. And so the differences in these definitions and approaches are really important because they determine both the direction that potential policy or diplomacy might take, but perhaps most importantly, they also determine the outcome of what these policies are. Second, as Dr. Davis said in her introduction about ideas about rivalrous supply chains or decoupled supply chains, there is maybe some limited evidence that we see these emerging, but it is limited. And I'll talk about it today, some evidence from one particular sector, critical minerals sector, particularly thinking about rare earths, about what they might actually look like if they do happen and what is happening right in this particular sector. But I'll also end, and this is my third point, that we should be cautious about this because meeting the challenges, the technical challenges of today, the environmental and perhaps so public health challenges of today require cooperation across rivalrous countries, and particularly they do it. I believe they require cooperation with China. So we need to think about these issues with precision and care. This topic's really important. Vulnerabilities in supply chains have been revealed very starkly in the last year and a half with the pandemic. But before that, we were also thinking very seriously about supply chain security, particularly because at these particular strategic sectors or nodes that might be geographically concentrated or nationally concentrated in production in some way. These are places that are vulnerable to geopolitical instability, to public health insecurity, and they're places that might be quickly weaponized or politicized. And we've seen this, of course, in the pandemic with personal protective equipment, with the manufacture of vaccines, but we also have seen this with semiconductors and things like this that have been in the news a lot. So because of this, we see sometimes these calls from national leaders, let's renationalize production. Let's bring things back home. Let's put in place export barriers. Let's not let maybe particular investments in order to win some sort of geo-economic battle or something related to strategic competition or perhaps escalating rivalry with China. But the global nature of these supply chains means that they need to happen, that adjustment and security has to happen globally. And so I'll talk about this from a Japanese perspective and whether or not we see this. So where we do see, I think, some bifurcated or decoupled supply chains happening are places that are maybe have these vulnerable nodes, but also things that are particularly key for a national champion industry, a strategic industry, or something related to national security. One of these sectors is critical minerals, and I'm going to talk about rare earths. Rare earth metals came into really intense focus in the world in 2010 when Japanese companies purported that they were unable to export they were unable to import rare earths from China in the middle of a territorial dispute over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. As we can see here in this chart at 2010, right in the middle here, over 90% of rare earths at that time were manufactured, produced in China. That's where they were mined. And when Japanese companies said that they were unable to import these metals right in the middle of this dispute, it seemed to Japanese entities that the rare earths had been weaponized. Now, whether this happened or not, I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A. It's a complicated, interesting question, but I'll put that aside because what was really important is that Japanese entities reacted as if they had been weaponized. This was a point of vulnerability in a supply chain, and it's a place where we can see how the state and the private sector responded to build a more resilient supply chain in response to this security threat. Now, we are all using rare earths right now as we watch this presentation, right? They're in the batteries. They're absolutely essential to a transition away from fossil fuels. They're minerals that are really important. They are not, despite their name, rare. This is also important when we think about resilience and diversification. You can see here's a map I made, so not active mines, but deposits are all around the world, almost every single continent. It's the potential, and there's also undersea mines, et cetera, or mining possible. And there are fewer mines. Most production is still focused in China. But an important part about rare earths is it's not just the mining of the rare earths, but it's also the post-processing. So rare earths, after they're mined, they need to be separated and refined into one of the 17 different elements, and in order to put them into batteries, into magnets, in order to make the things that we want to. This is not just, I'm sure a few other elements here, because this is about many different critical minerals. I could tell this story about things other than rare earths, although that's what I'll focus on. That here on the right-hand side, we see percentages of processing of minerals that are crucial to a post-fossil fuel transition. And we can see they are highly geographically concentrated. So in order to build a supply chain that is not dependent on China, not only do you need to mine them somewhere else, but you also need to develop the technologies and the capacity to process them somewhere else as well. And most of that today all of that today is dominated in the rare earth sector by China. So after this crisis started, how did Japan respond? So there were three different elements to their supply chain security approach, which I think can be generalized. So the first, and I think the most important, are private sector efforts. So first, there are business organizations such as the chambers of commerce in various countries, the Japanese chambers of commerce and industry, as well as umbrella groups like Heidanren, that told both the Japanese government, but also the Chinese government communicated to them they needed certainty in the supply chain, and that was key. But then there was also an element of the private sector called general trading companies, of which the Japan people here are all quite familiar with, that are key large players in developing the logistics and also the supply chains for Japanese firms. So there were general trading companies that immediately, starting when there was this rare earth crunch, trying to diversify mining and post-processing capacity abroad. And these are companies like Sumitomo, Sojitsu, and Toyota Tsusho in particular were major players. They did this solo, but also in conjunction with the Japanese state. And so the key policies that were pursued, there was an industrial policy, which I'll talk about, and also the role of a state-owned enterprise in Japan called JOGMEC, the Japan Oil, Gas, and Metals Corporation. And JOGMEC, often in conjunction with these general trading companies, started to set up new mines around the world, many of which were not successful in actually producing rare earths, and some of which were. And I'll show a map in just a moment. But the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry also set up a new subsidy program in order to develop supply chain security in this sector. And it was three-pronged. First, developing technological alternatives that did not require these particular minerals. Second, putting money into research and development into recycling technologies, that's sometimes known as urban mining or the circular economy. And then third, giving subsidies to firms to help promote international diversification, what we often think about with supply chain security. It's setting up new subsidiaries abroad. Now, the METI money, as well as the efforts from JOGMEC, what they particularly tried to do was to overcome the initial risks of setting up mining in an environmentally and socially risky sector, in particular working with smaller companies that did not have the deep capital reserves of mining giants like Rio Tinto. And so these are smaller entrants to the market. They did this around the world. And so here we see a map so that the triangles on this map represent the JOGMEC projects. The one that has really borne fruit for Japan is the mine in Australia, which has a processing plant in Malaysia, and that is the non-China supply chain that is supplying the metals that are needed for Toyota's Prius batteries. Toyota electric vehicles that are produced in China use Chinese rare earths, so we have separate supply chains. But we also see a lot of these projects that haven't started producing yet, or have failed and have already entered bankruptcy. And we also see there's some other elements of sort of diplomacy that go on here, and I'm happy to talk about that a little more if people are curious. The third thing we saw was a multilateral approach on critical minerals. So fairly quickly after the 2010 crisis, Japan, the United States, and the European Union started a case against China's export quotas in rare earths at the WTO. They prevailed there. China dropped the export quotas, shifted to production quotas. So there was a multilateral legal approach. But beyond that, sort of at the everyday level or twice a year level, Japan and the United States, and then later inviting Australia and the European Union actors as well, have a critical minerals summit. At the summit, they share research strategies, knowledge about the most recent research on critical minerals, trying to cooperate in order to bring these things to market outside of China, which really does have a strong advantage in the industry. Very similar language is what we see, for example, in the critical minerals. We also are starting to see deployed in things like the 2021 US-Japan Core Partnership, which was announced after Suga visited Washington this year. Was this successful? Well, yeah, it worked. Japan, as you can see, this is looking at percentage of exports. The green here is China. About 90%, 90+% of Japanese imports came from China right before this crisis, and then it shifts to Asia. This is again, this is largely coming from there are some mines in Vietnam, but a lot of it's Malaysia. So there are Australian minerals being processed in Asia, shipped to Japan. And I showed the United States at the bottom here, so you can see there's a lot more continuity, that they hadn't responded in the same way. So this is not a global shift, this is a Japanese shift that was a response to this geopolitical crisis. So I think that this reflects what Japan is doing more generally. So first we have private, so when we think about supply chain security strategies, first we have the private sector, and that's the most important place to look, because that's who's doing the supply chains. And so we have what's called very often China +1 diversification, stay in China, also go somewhere else. We can see, again, starting around between like 2010, 2012, a shift to the +1 countries. This is usually Southeast Asia and India, so ASEAN plus India. Most of it's ASEAN. India is a very small chunk of this overall. But there's been a big push towards India vocally. So this is largely private sector driven. We can also see like new subsidiaries are also moving into the +1 countries. This just goes through 2015, but sort of the trend, the dotted line there, the +1 countries, and the percentage going to China is declining as overall. We also see moves towards industrial policy, again, in these very specific strategic sectors. policies that incentivize reshoring or diversification. There is a policy from last year, again from METI, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, for medical, PPE, semiconductors, things like this. And these, again, were largely going, then the diversification move, largely going to Southeast Asia. Rare earths, again, were included in this policy as one of those critical sectors. And then lastly, we see multilateralism. And we see this increasingly, that cooperation with the United States, for example, with the core partnership, let's see where that goes. The Quad just met. You can see in this, for the people who don't read Japanese, these are all very political reasons that the Quad is meeting. It's very securitized. Maybe we'll see more economic cooperation there. It's something we can discuss. And will we see actual coordinated industrial policy? Well, I'm not going to put any money on that yet, but that's something that we should keep an eye on. And again, I'm happy to discuss that further. So I want to end just with two cautionary points. First, supply chain security for states, where we think about, countries wanting to secure their national security, public health, et cetera, might not be the same thing as what firms often call supply chain resilience, which is the ability, the firms define it in different ways, but there may be a mismatch, and the private sector might not be willing to react to geopolitical concerns of states. And so do you want to carrot that, or does a state want to do that with a carrot or with a stick, or to try and get everyone to go together? Right? I think it's important not to politicize what might be apolitical for firms, in particular because the politicization of it can lead to retaliation. And that creates further uncertainty for firms and an inability to react quickly. And lastly, and again, that in order to respond to the challenges, particularly of climate change today, to transition to post-fossil fuel world, other things as well, it's really hard to see how to do that without cooperating with China. With critical minerals, for example, China remains by far the most important player in the sector due to decades and decades of research and development and investment in the sector. And that's something that we need to pay attention to and not throw away because of geopolitical frictions. And I really thank you for your attention, and I really look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating deep dive into the rare earths example that runs so many things, and also a look at firm strategies to diversify, not necessarily coming home, but to other markets. And I think you're right to ask, what is supply chain security for firms versus governments? Let's now turn to look at the government perspective and how Europe has been approaching the possible need to screen some FDI. Professor Sophie Meunier, would you like to present?
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to be showing. So first of all, thank you very much to the organizers for putting together this really amazing panel of very interesting women who are focusing on different regions of the world. I'm very happy to be part of this, and a big thanks to Professor Davis, my former Princeton colleague, for putting this together. I decided to focus today on the other side of the title of today's panel. Kristin talked mostly about supply chains. I'm going to talk about the investment screening part. And the reason I'm doing this is that because this is brand new, it's a brand new policy in the European Union. So because it's new, I just wanted to let people know that it is new and show a little bit how it works. And my talk today is based in part on the paper that I recently published with Zenobia Chan on this issue. But I would also be happy in the Q&A period to talk about work that Sarah and I are doing together about investment screening in general, not only in the EU or the US, but more generally. So we'll save that for later. So what is this new investment screening mechanism at the EU level, and why did the EU decide that, even though it didn't have this before, all of a sudden in recent years it has felt the need to create such investment screening? So I'll talk briefly about the genesis of that policy, why different countries in the EU have different preferences when it comes to investment screening. I'll describe how it works and how it has worked in practice. It's not even been there for a year. So we're almost a year in. And then I'll talk a little bit about the future of investment screening in Europe and potential cooperation with the US and maybe other partners. Okay, so up until 2019, investment screening did not exist at the European Union level. They were at the time 28 member states, 28 countries in the European Union before Brexit. But investment screening—
briefly, I'm sorry. Your notes are showing up, and
sorry.
Can you enlarge to show the full screen of your slides?
Okay.
It'll make it easier for us to read.
Sorry, I'm not sure what's happening there. Yeah, I clicked on the wrong button.
You share a different screen, Sophie.
Sorry.
I think you may need to share a different screen. Go back to share screen and reshare.
Okay, so stop share. Oops, sorry. Not sure what's happening here.
That's perfect.
Perfect.
Okay, good.
Great,
So, okay. So I was saying is that up until 2019, there were very few, not even half of the 28 countries in the European Union were screening incoming foreign investment. And EU countries were among the most open to foreign direct investment in the world. So the question is, what changed in recent years, and why did all of a sudden the Europeans felt the need that they needed to collectively screen incoming investment? And there are basically three reasons for that. The first one is that there was a growing recognition inside Europe that what was happening in another European country, the investment that was coming into a different European country, had actually implications for the other countries in Europe, mostly because of the nature of the single market inside Europe, and also the creation of big industrial policy like EU-wide projects. Investment could be coming into one country, and then let's say, for instance, a Chinese firm would invest in a European country, and then they would produce goods that would circulate freely throughout the rest of Europe. So there was this recognition that what was happening in one country had implication for another because they were completely interdependent because of the single market. The second big reason is an institutional reason, which is that the 2009 Lisbon Treaty, which is basically the equivalent of the constitution for the European Union, transferred some of the authority over foreign investment policy making to the EU level. Before, that authority, or competence in EU speak, that authority belonged solely to the national countries. But because of that institutional change, all of a sudden the EU could take charge of some of this. And for other reasons I've written about, that transfer of authority was not very clear in the treaty. So it took about 7 years going through various court cases for the issue to be adjudicated and sorted out. But after 2016, it became pretty clear that the EU was in charge of most FDI policy in Europe. And the third one, which is probably the biggest one, is the changing nature of the foreign investors who invested in the EU, and especially the surge of Chinese direct investment in Europe that started about a decade ago, or at the end of the 2000 decade. Okay, so, oops. Okay, so very briefly, a chronology. So you know what happened, it started in 2012. That's the first time that some Europeans asked the European Commission, which is a little bit like the executive, but completely. They said, we should consider doing some investment screening together, but then they were told no. Then in 2017, France, Germany, and Italy, which were some of the countries with the most Chinese investment actually, formally asked the EU to create some kind of mechanism to screen and maybe block foreign takeovers. Then a few months later, the Commission actually announced that it was going to move ahead with that policy. It took about 14 months for them to negotiate with the member states and with the various institutions in the EU. And finally, this was adopted and I implemented, sorry, I got the dates wrong. It was adopted in March 2019 and implemented in October 2020. So we're almost a year in now that the mechanism has been. So why did it take, why wasn't it easier to pass early on when it was first proposed in 2012? It's because the different countries of the European Union did not see eye to eye on this issue. They had very different preferences when it came to whether they wanted to be able to block investment and screen investment or not. And there were different groups of countries. And in the paper, we kind of built an index of where the different countries fell. But mostly, the most important part to know is that France and Germany, which are the two biggest economies in Europe, are the ones who were pushing for investment screening done at the European level. And basically everybody else opposed this or did not care too much about it. So we kind of group the countries in trying to understand their preferences, and they fall in different groups. You have countries like France and Germany, which are the countries with the most technology intensive assets. So basically, if you have an economy that's based on technology, you are very, very scared of some potential Chinese or other foreign investment. So you want to have the possibility to screen and maybe block some of the investment. Then you had countries which had a lot of assets for sale as a result of the euro crisis. So that's mostly Greece, Portugal, a few other countries that had these privatization programs put in place because they needed to reimburse the debt that they had. And so they put all these assets for sale and basically no one was buying these assets except maybe for some Chinese investors, maybe a few Russian investors, but mostly Chinese investors. So they didn't want in other countries to tell them which investment they could allow or not. Then you have another group of countries which have a liberal free trading ideology like the Netherlands or Sweden. And these countries really were fearful of protectionism and they did not want investment screening. Then you had another group of countries like Cyprus, Malta, Luxembourg, and Ireland, which kind of hubs of investment. And they didn't want the other countries in Europe to tell them what they could or could not do. And then you had another group of countries, which are the ones which are maybe the bad students in Europe and were afraid that at some point the EU might want to retaliate against them for various reasons, having to do mostly with illiberalism. So they're happy to have outside options. And that's like Hungary, for instance. So they didn't want screening. And finally, you had a bunch of countries that just had not given much thought to this. So in the paper, we actually tested two hypotheses for that. One, which is that the support is mostly driven by the technological intensity of your economy. And the other one was the reliance on Chinese FDI. We thought that maybe countries that rely a lot on Chinese FDI would be the most opposed. But in the end, the only thing you need to remember is that the only thing that really mattered to determine the original positions on that is how much technology you have in your economy. So countries that have a lot of technology are very afraid and want screening, and countries that don't, they simply don't care too much. So in the end, they created a screening mechanism at the European level. So it's a mechanism that applies only to extra-EU FDI. So there's no screening of FDI coming from other European countries in Europe, right? Then second point is that screening is not on economic grounds, but only on national security grounds. So transactions that may threaten security or public order. Third, I know Sarah's going to talk about CFIUS. This is not the European equivalent of CFIUS. There is no review board. It does not, most importantly, it does not replace or it does not supersede national screening mechanisms, but instead it creates this kind of cooperation network between EU member states, national screening authorities, and the Commission. And most importantly, the final authority over whether you accept a transaction or not rests with the home country of the investment. So the EU or France can tell Germany, you know, we're not very comfortable with that Chinese investment that's coming into your factory in North Rhine-Westphalia. But in the end, Germany will determine whether they accept the investment or not, even though now the others can tell them, can get some information and can tell them how they feel about it. So, okay, I'll try to go briefly, just so you know how it works. It's not a review board like CFIUS, but it is centralized in the European Commission and it's centralized in the trade unit. So even though this is an interagency like in the US process that involves also competition issues and other issues, it is centralized in trade. And there's a very tight timeline of how things are done. So I might go into the details in Q&A if you want to know how it works. But just in a nutshell, the country that receives the investment has to notify everybody else in Europe that there's this transaction happening. And so everybody else in Europe has time to weigh in, very short time to weigh in, and then give recommendations. And as I said, it's almost a year in, so we'll get the full report of how that went very soon. So just to finish, where is the EU investment screening framework going? So there's been a clear impact of the pandemic there. In the early days of the pandemic, there were some potential stock market crashes in Europe, which caused a lot of worry and panic in some member states, which then very quickly led to an expansion of the scope of national review for screening. More sectors became covered by screening. The thresholds beyond which a transaction is scrutinized were lowered. There was a realization that healthcare and pharma are strategic sectors that are part of national security. And there was a slowdown of M&A activity, which really enabled the screening at the EU level to get started with maybe a small workload. Now, relations with the US. In the early days, when the EU was setting up the mechanism, it actually learned a lot from the US, which shared the best practices because it has a long history of doing this, shared practices about case management, about how to do case analysis, etc. After that, when the EU mechanism started to be implemented, there was no sharing or cooperation on actual cases. Everything is very secret. But we are now moving, this is actually the first week, this week, that there will be the first meeting of the new US-EU Trade and Technology Council, the TTC, which is meeting in 2 days. And it's supposed to be, among other things, setting up a working group on investment screening in cooperation between the EU and the US. So we'll see where that goes. And future reforms that more member states, remember when it started, only 11 out of 28 actually were screening foreign investment, but now it's already 18 and there's more in the works. So there's a quick map for you of the countries that do have screening already and the countries that will have screening soon. And so soon it will be almost all of them. And finally, there might be some reform coming in the years to come after they try this process for a few years. There's a few potential problems that we can already see, but I'm happy to talk about this in Q&A. So just to summarize everything, the EU now has investment screening. It's not like the US, like we'll hear from Sarah, but it is a first step.
Thank you so much. We don't quite have a single voice, but at least they are talking and sharing information. And it'll be interesting how coordination with the United States can go along. The definition of what is sensitive might be different. Let's hear from Professor Bauerle-Danzman about the United States decisions on investment screening, supply chain security. where the United States has a long tradition, indeed some screening of Japanese products well before screening out China.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, everyone can see my screen, I assume, just checking.
Yes.
On that. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Well, let me begin by thanking Christina and her team for inviting me to participate in this panel, and to my co-presenters for their highly informative presentations, and also to a large audience. I'm very excited for the engaging discussion that we're about to have. So I've been tasked with discussing the United States approach to investment screening and how this relates to supply chain security. What I'm going to do in my short time is overview the US's investment screening mechanism, discuss how investment screening should be thought of as one authority of many in the supply chain security policy toolbox, and emphasize how investment screening coordination among allies is becoming increasingly important as these authorities proliferate globally. So first, let me overview how investment screening or investment security review works in the United States. The screening mechanism in the US is called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS. CFIUS was created in 1975 by executive order and has since undergone 3 major regulatory changes, all of which have expanded the scope and strengthened the committee's authorities. CFIUS operates as an interagency committee, which is chaired by the Department of Treasury. 8 other federal agencies have a voting seat on the committee, ranging from the Department of Defense to the Department of Commerce. This whole of government approach is designed to bring many voices, perspectives, and equities to the table, which is quite different from other countries that house their screening authority in one ministry, which may look at a transaction from only a military or only a commercial perspective. And in practice, the committee mostly operates by consensus rather than by a majority vote. The committee is tasked with reviewing covered transactions for possible national security risk. A transaction is covered if it targets a US business, and the transaction, if concluded, would provide a foreign person with control over that US business. Additionally, since early 2020, CFIUS also has jurisdiction to review non-controlling transactions if the US target is considered a critical technology, critical infrastructure, or sensitive personal data business, and if the foreign investor gains some kind of special non-passive rights for their investment, even though it is non-controlling. So once CFIUS has jurisdiction, it then reviews the transaction to determine if the transaction presents a national security risk. If the committee identifies a risk, it then determines if it is possible to mitigate that risk through a national security agreement with the parties. If mitigation is not possible, then CFIUS communicates this to the transaction parties, who can then decide to withdraw and abandon the transaction. But if they choose not to abandon the transaction, CFIUS will refer the matter to the president, who has the authority to prohibit the transaction through a presidential order. Presidential determinations are non-judiciable, meaning that parties cannot challenge the national security risk analysis that undergirds a presidential prohibition in court. And this table, which I've compiled from publicly available sources, provides details on CFIUS activity from 2005 to 2018, although if you pull it up to today, you're going to see kind of very similar patterns from 2018 to today. And you will see that presidential blocks are exceedingly rare. There have only been 7 blocks in the history of CFIUS, but there has been a steady rise in transactions that are mitigated and transactions that are abandoned in recent years. Still, CFIUS reviews a small but growing minority of total cross-border M&A deals each year, and only about 5% of all deals in the US are withdrawn, mitigated, or blocked through committee actions. So this is a small but growing component of US cross-border M&A activity. I want to highlight a few key features of the CFIUS process. First, while CFIUS has received much more attention from politicians and the press in recent years, it is supposed to be a tool of last resort. When the president issues a prohibition, the order always states that there are no other provisions in law that can adequately mitigate the national security risk. Thus, CFIUS is best seen as a stopgap measure to protect national security when existing authorities are inadequate, often because the risk that arises from the particular transaction is novel. The US government prefers to lean on regulatory measures that are clear ex ante and that apply broadly rather than case-by-case screening. Such measures, for example, could include things like export controls, cybersecurity standards, the Foreign Agent Registration Act, and FCC rules. Second, and this point has some tension built into it that we can discuss in Q&A, the CFIUS process has traditionally operated to fastidiously focus on the uniqueness of each transaction before the committee. While certain investors are of more concern to the committee than others, each transaction receives its own threat assessment because the committee emphasizes the second part of the phrase in statute, national security risk arising from the transaction, when it conducts its review. Third, CFIUS has recently undergone some significant changes due to the 2018 passage and the 2020 implementation of the bipartisan Foreign Investment Risk Review and Modernization Act, or FIRMA. First, while previously CFIUS was mainly focused on the US defense industrial base, and since 2007 on critical infrastructure, CFIUS now is particularly concerned with transactions that implicate critical technology, in a nod to some of what Sophie was talking about, that may have dual use applications, and also on sensitive personal data businesses. FIRMA also expands CFIUS jurisdiction to venture capital due to concerns that Chinese investors, and maybe others, but mostly Chinese, may have been skirting CFIUS review by investing in tech startups through VC funding rounds. There are also new authorities over real estate investments close to defense bases and other locations that have national security implications. FIRMA also enables CFIUS to engage in more information sharing about sensitive transactions and problematic parties with US allies, and also creates a very limited set of regulatory carve-outs for investors from a small set of accepted states. This is a list Japan is currently not on, but which has publicly expressed a strong interest in joining. And perhaps most importantly, FIRMA has transformed CFIUS from a mostly voluntary process to one that is increasingly mandatory. In contrast to other countries that have sectoral specific but mandatory screening, CFIUS has broad sectoral authority, but firms generally engage with the committee on a voluntary basis. The incentive to do so is that CFIUS provides cleared transactions with safe harbor, meaning that the government cannot retroactively require divestment or impose other restrictions on cleared transactions. FIRMA has made a subset of transactions subject to mandatory filings, mainly investments in critical technology businesses and transactions in which a foreign government-controlled entity obtains a substantial interest in a US business. And FIRMA has also ramped up CFIUS's non-notified procedure, in which the US government closely monitors transactions that were not filed to CFIUS and reaches out to parties if they're concerned about the transaction to initiate a post-closing review. So now that I've talked about what CFIUS is and what it does, let's move to what this all means for supply chain security. Here I want to make 2 points. First, CFIUS is increasingly asked to explicitly consider how a transaction may affect the security of critical supply chains in its analysis. CFIUS has always been concerned with supply chain integrity when it comes to military procurement. When Congress passed FIRMA, it also wrote new sense of Congress provisions that provide CFIUS guidance about the kinds of concerns they should consider when evaluating the national security risks of transactions. 2 of these new provisions directly relate to supply chain fragility and security. First is a provision that directs CFIUS to consider multi-transaction patterns of control that may indicate a threat actor is attempting to create critical supply chain bottlenecks. Semiconductor supply chains are of particular concern here. Second, a new provision focuses on the national security implications of transactions that may reduce the availability of key inputs into US supply chains that have some nexus with national security. I want to emphasize here that national security is not defined in the US statute, and the government has expanded its conception of what national security entails in recent years. So while this provision might have read as one focused only on the defense industrial base just 10 years ago, today this provision likely implicates a whole host of supply chains beyond those related directly to defense procurement. My second point is I want to caution against the impulse to use CFIUS as a catch-all tool to strengthen supply chains, which it's not really well designed to do. As mentioned before, CFIUS works best as a fail-safe to stop a transaction that poses a novel security threat that has not already been dealt with through other regulatory means. There are many other tools that can more effectively incentivize the types of commercial behaviors that can strengthen supply chains. I think Kristin's presentation did a really good job of kind of talking through how supply chain resilience is really complicated. So the types of tools that I'm talking about here include things like export controls, various forms of government fiscal support to make redundancies in supply chains commercially viable. The Commerce Department has this new supply chain resilience program that can gather data on complex supply chains that is fundamentally necessary to begin to identify weaknesses in those supply chains. And that's something that has come out of the Biden-Harris 100-day supply chain review, which I encourage everyone to read in its entirety. There's also tools like minimum standard regulations for cyber and supply chain management, along with things like workforce development initiatives to make reshoring and friendshoring of critical components of supply chains possible. And finally, I want to close with the reflection that complex supply chains also make investment screening coordination across allies increasingly important, because many cross-border M&As now need to gain clearance from multiple review bodies. A good example in the news right now is Wise Capital's proposed acquisition of Magnachip, which looks like it may be blocked by CFIUS because Magnachip is listed in the US, but its footprint is mostly in South Korea, and it's generally thought of as a Korean company. So in a shameless plug, as Sophie alluded to, we have a new data set that provides detailed coding of investment screening mechanisms in OECD countries from 2007 onward across a range of characteristics of interests that is important. Is an important starting point for policy analysis, as well as social science research on the causes and consequences of various designs of investment screening mechanisms. And with that, I have exceeded my time, so I'll stop there, and I'm really looking forward to a fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's amazing to hear about the US efforts to screen without having to find what is national security. And the idea of friendshoring, of encouraging investment to move either to the US, if not the US, friendly shores is an interesting concept that matches with Kristin's discussion of Japan encouraging China +1 so that investors diversify their supply chains as one path to more resilience and less dependence. So there's many cross-cutting themes that we've seen in our 3 presentations about how can you diversify supply chains? How can you screen if a particular investment may be seen as risky? At the same time, there's so much to be gained from global interdependence. Is there a risk that governments will go too far in shutting out profitable investments, and diversity will be inefficient? what do we think are going to be the biases as governments take a heavier hand in fostering particular locations for investment and screening out particular sources of investment? Do you think that governments may intervene too heavily, especially when we think of industrial policy coordination? We saw coordination within Europe of friends. We hear possibilities of coordination at the Quad level, and of course, Europe and the United States. Is this the new Cold War of investment policy? What do you think about these topics? So that was a big presentation series on deep topics. I've thrown out a few questions. I'd like to turn to one of our associates in the program on US-Japan relations to ask a question. We have until, I think 1:15, so we have 20 minutes for questions from the audience. And let's first have Mr. Uchiyama, who is a professor at the Graduate School of Social Sciences, Chiba University, where he studies management, accounting, and corporate value creation. Professor Uchiyama, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Can you hear me? Okay. Oh, thank you, Professor Davis. Thank you all for your enlightening research and the presentation. Today's discussion focuses on China as a hypothetical target country. So my question is that if the need for screening regulations and risk management mainly due to the economic characteristics of China, such as its large economic scale as a market or supplier, its rapidly increasing competitiveness, and so on? Or is it mainly due to the political and the military characteristics as its ideology and so on? Which is the greater weight? Please give us your thought about that. Thank you.
If you could please each provide a brief answer to Professor Uchiyama and any thoughts you have to my remarks or the presentations of others. I'll start in, I guess, the order of our presentations. So Kristin, if you want to go first.
Great. Yeah, that's a great question. If you think about this from a private sector perspective, there's certainly, I mean, it's a tough country to compete with, right? Because of scale, because of large scale manufacturing and increasing tech sophistication. But if we think about this in terms of supply chain security, the political economy of China, the economic characteristics are so deeply related to the political characteristics, in particular to the range of investment rules within China, what is allowed, what is not allowed. That makes it difficult sometimes for foreign firms to compete, also competing with state-owned enterprises, right? All of these political characteristics. So even putting aside frictions and the non-economic topics, I think that this focus on China, not just as the hypothetical target country, but usually as, right, the one that we're mostly talking about, or that policymakers are mostly talking about, is due to both.
Thank you. That's a really good, very good question. If it is due to both as well. I mean, in the case of Europeans, there's several issues there. I mean, one is that, and it's true both for Europeans and for Americans, I think, that there is no historical precedent for having a country that's not an ally who's going to invest in big numbers in your own country. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union did not really invest in the West. So we don't have a frame of reference. So there's part of, for this reason, there's a lot of unease about not only the dual use technology, but the fact that China has very clearly stated that it is trying to acquire a lot of IP and a lot of technology in order to become self-sufficient. So if you're not sure, if you think that China is not an ally, I mean, here the Europeans are quite different from the Americans because they don't necessarily see China as the big geopolitical competitor, and they're trying hard to put themselves somewhere in the middle, not necessarily to be allied completely with the US on this, but still there's this dimension, geopolitical dimension. But there's also a political dimension, which is that because the Chinese system is organized, because the Chinese economy and the management of the economy and the political system is what it is in China, it is very difficult for foreign countries to figure out what the real intent of a lot of these investment transactions are. So is a Chinese company, whether it's private or whether it's a state-owned enterprise or whether it's even a mixed-owned enterprise, are they investing in this European country because they're trying to maximize profit like investors usually do? Or are they investing because they are carrying out some kind of a master plan that has been decided by non-economic actors? It's very difficult for outsiders to assess, to make that determination. And so that's why a lot of this screening is not necessarily targeted at China. And we should be clear that, and Sarah will say the same about CFIUS, that China is not the only country of origin of investment that is being, whose investments are being reviewed. In Europe, there's a lot of even investments from the US that actually are giving rise to some of that scrutiny. And the same way in the US, there's some investment from Europe or from Japan. So China is not the only one, but it is obviously this big looming force, looming large. So it's a mix of both.
And to follow on here, I mean, these are really big questions, and so we could just discuss them for hours and hours. But for the sake of brevity, I would say first to Professor Uchiyama's question, which I took to really be a question about: is this is this economic protectionism, or is this genuinely coming from a national security kind of concern perspective? I think that at least in the context of the United States, this is national security first. CFIUS doesn't spend its time talking about, we should block this transaction, because China doesn't let us do this or China doesn't let us do that, right? That this is really that the discussions around the table are squarely national security concerns. But also, to echo what Kristin said, the political economy of China makes it very hard for the US government to really see the light of day between the PRC and its firms, right? And so there's a growing sense that the PRC has not done anything to dissuade, in fact, has actually made several steps to make this even more of a concern, that challenging the idea that there's really such a thing as a private firm in China to the same extent that there are private enterprises in other parts of the world. To briefly touch on Christina's excellent questions, which I wish that we could again discuss for hours and hours, on the point about how to get the balance right, and are we in danger of overshooting? I think that this is a real potential problem. I will note that in the US case, and I think also in the European case as well, that as regulations move forward in this area, there's always a chapeau in the beginning of any of these rules that that emphasizes the importance of an open economy and an open investment environment. Biden's supply chain security review, which I mentioned before, specifically emphasizes that for supply chains to be secure, they need to be global in nature. And so there's definitely a component in the government that's really trying to push to say, like, we still need globalization, we just need some guardrails. And how multilateral the policy response ends up being is going to be really essential here for how much we're still going to have a very globalized world versus one that's very kind of bifurcated. I do think it's going to be increasingly hard to simultaneously serve the China market and the US market and maybe the European market at the same time. And I think that that's going to be a huge challenge for some of the reasons that Kristin mentioned. But, you know, I think that we also need to be clear that there are several things that the PRC is doing here that's also making this really challenging. We tend to talk about this from the perspective of the like Western countries are kind of getting very frustrated at China because China is growing very quickly and then putting in all these regulations in place. But the PRC is also doing things that create more inflammation here. But you know, they would say that they are trying to protect their interests. They've introduced all kinds of like blocking rules that make it impossible for companies operating in China to follow US directives around things like sanctions and so forth. And if those are fully implemented, companies are simply not going to be able to operate in both of those markets simultaneously. So time will tell how this works out.
Great. I'm going to summarize a few questions from the chat and then call on the three people who have their hands raised and give you an opportunity to selectively answer. So in the chat, we have a few questions about ways to strengthen screening. So Professor Io Kibe of Tokyo University in the program in US-Japan relations is interested in whether the European process will become stronger. Is this another gradual integration? And we see Gabby Chung, who is a postdoctoral fellow in the program of US-Japan relations, asking if Japan is going to also pay attention to the question of intellectual property rights and patent allocation, which is a way that you can see risk of global supply chains being dominated by China or other countries. And we also see the question from Vice Admiral and the Japanese military, now associate with the Asia Center, Admiral Ikeda, who asks about whether confidentiality makes it difficult for governments to coordinate because they are sharing information about dual-use goods and sensitive products. And especially for Japan, confidentiality and conversations and discussions in government have been difficult. And so those are a few questions about ways the screening process may change. Now let's turn to our three participants who would like to ask questions in person. Joining us from Tokyo, Mr. Keita Azuma, who works in the cabinet office and is staying up late. I'll have you ask your question first. Panelists, hold your response till we get our other two questioners in. Go ahead, Mr. Azuma.
Thank you very much, Professor Davis, and thank you very much for all three speakers for this really great speech. And I'd like to ask kind of a technical questions for all three speakers and how to coordinate the definition of critical technology, especially in emerging technologies. Actually, could you share kind of a specific criteria to assess the magnitude of national security threat for FDI, especially in emerging technology? I think there are some gap and difference among kind of allies, US, EU, and Japan. So I'd like to, make sure about that.
Great. Ben Rutledge.
Thanks very much. I'm a research fellow at the Corporate Responsibility Initiative. My question is for Kristin, and I'll keep it very brief. You talked about resilience of supply chains and security, supply chain security, but largely through the lens of security of supply of products and goods and additional geopolitical considerations. And I just wondered whether you'd seen on your radar security of supply chains through assessments of environmental or social risks, and whether that was being considered by either businesses or political movements. Grateful for your reflections on that, and whether you could see anything similar to perhaps the US Customs and Border protection efforts on forced labor or additional sort of screening efforts in Japan? Thank you.
Thank you. Christian Rodriguez-Scheffel.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm a fellow at the David Rockefeller Center here at Harvard. My question is about a little bit of the flip side, the limitations for these screening mechanisms. Of course, CFIUS and the US mechanism predates NAFTA and predates most bilateral investment treaties from the US, so it's exempted from national treatment and most favored nation provisions in, for example, investment treaties. This is not the case with Europe. This is definitely not the case with other countries that are implementing. So the question maybe to Sophie, but also others is, how do you see the conflict between international commitments, particularly investment agreements or bilateral investment treaties and application of screening, which will limit foreign direct investment and probably violate national treatment and MFN?
Thank you very much for excellent questions. Sarah, can you start us off? And this will be a chance to wrap up answering several of the questions as we come to the closing time of our panel.
Absolutely. So first of all, I'm not going to be able to answer everything. So I'll also put my my email address in the chat. I'd love to continue conversations with those who want to follow up afterwards. So quickly, in terms of confidentiality, this is a huge issue. It's a huge issue, not just in terms of sharing information about what is sensitive to governments, but also in terms of making sure that the materials that are provided by the parties to governments in order to facilitate review are kept confidential as well. And that is because this is information that is very sensitive and also valuable to the firms. And in order for screening to work well, the parties need to trust that the governments are going to keep this material confidential so that so that this doesn't leak in the press. And so all I can say about that is that that is a trust building exercise that is also based off of what sort of third party risks might be associated with sharing information across countries. There is a reason why the 3 countries on the accepted states list for the US case are all Five Eyes countries. That will be very important going forward. In terms of critical technology and how to define it, CFIUS was passed alongside ECRA, which is, or the FIRMA legislation was passed alongside ECRA, which is the Export Control, an Export Control Act. And so critical technology in FIRMA was defined as what is on the emerging and foundational technology list. There's a lot of problems there because export controls don't work well unless they are multilateral in nature. And so there's a whole issue about how to get these emerging technologies under a multilateral export control when the Wassenaar arrangement, which is where a lot of these dual use technologies are controlled, also has Russia on that, like in the Wassenaar arrangement. And so it limits what can be done there. And then in terms of conflict between international commitments and screening, a really good question, but I think that there's not a lot of deference to international commitments right now by a lot of countries, and also from the perspective of bilateral investment treaties, there's normally some amount of national security carve out that countries will use to get around, get around these issues.
Great, thank you, Sophie.
Okay, thank you for those. Are all great questions, the ones in the chat too. So I'll be very brief. I'll answer only a few of them. The first Karu Yokube's question about whether in Europe this is a first step towards screening or whether we should expect stagnation after that. I can make only a prediction because this has been going on for less than a year, but my prediction is that it is indeed the first step, that the Europeans got what they could, the lowest common denominator mechanism they could put in place when they did in 2019, because there was so much internal opposition. But even since then, since 2019, there's been a lot of shift in Europe towards more support for investment screening, in part because of the pandemic. And now we'll see after a year or 2 or 3 of implementation of national screening, of EU screening in Europe, what will happen. So my prediction is that it's only the first step. but that they will be pushed for more screening once there will be some crisis between different EU member states regarding this issue. So maybe a transaction will happen in one member state, and then the others will say, you cannot let this happen, this is endangering us all. And then the member state will say, I don't care, I have the final word. So I think when that happens, there will be a push towards more screening. And I see Christina's in a hurry, so I'll just answer one more, which is the question about the cooperation between countries and the friendshoring. And I will say here, as a French person, yes, it's very important, but you have to make sure who your friends are. And this is why the recent dispute between France and the US was so important, because if there's any country inside Europe that shares, as closely as possible the same goals as the United States when it comes to this investment from China, the threats, it is France. Most other European countries don't really support the same goals. So there might be some cooperation with the US, but it's really France that is carrying that cooperation. So you just have to make sure that you know who your friends are.
Yes, we can affirm that we are seeing France as a friend and will cooperate. Kristin.
Yeah, thank you for all of these great questions. I'm going to speak, of course, very briefly and try and speak really broadly here to wrap up a little bit. That the questions about how do we coordinate, what does it mean to be a critical technology? And I think that's closely related to the question, Christina, that you asked is, might we see governments intervene too heavily? Might we see technologies become securitized, become critical because of particular political pressures, or simply because of tough competition with an emerging China market that's really, really good at certain sectors and increasingly good in many sectors. And so there are incentives for some firms, to push to be a critical industry. And I see some evidence of that happening, and that becomes. And then there's these policy dynamics, and that gets built in, and we have path dependence, and things might become more securitized. And across countries, those might, what is critical? Well, what's critical is what our firms are telling us, where we're having trouble developing our own supply chain that doesn't have so another country doesn't have cumulative control, as that phrase goes. But Japan has cumulative control in some sectors. Are those critical? It certainly makes the United States has cumulative control in some sectors. Does that make those critical? It's very, I think that we're on a dangerous path to make it on this sort of Cold War of investment policy if we over-define what critical means. That said, we have seen some sectors become overt tools of economic coercion, and there is uncertainty about what others might be. I really like Ben's question. It's something I'm doing a project on right now, and I have way too much to say. So let's try and connect offline, Ben, because and in critical minerals, it's something that's just, it's deeply important and really tough. So we can talk about that. But this last question of how would China might respond, and how might these harm China, right? So if you use tools of coercion yourself, you are inviting retaliation. Will that deeply harm the Chinese domestic economy in the short run? I don't think so, but that does not mean that we're not going to start seeing it tit for tat.
Thank you so much. This has been a really informative discussion. We've seen the global economy go one direction to complete interdependence. And now there's a fear of a backlash towards decoupling and self-reliance. But how would you decide which products has been one question. When is it so vital that you must produce it at home? And if the US thinks steel is vital, what next? And if you're trying to bring things to safety, national production, you're vulnerable to your own shutdowns. And that is itself a vulnerability. So you might want to diversify to friends, but who are the friends? We could see politicization. If even the US and France can have a spat over something like a submarine deal, we worry that there could be politicization of supply chains that makes business unstable. And so we have to hope that discussions like today and government mechanisms can achieve the right balance so that there can be reasonable checks and balances on reliance with foreign partners, critical goods, without throwing away all of the cooperative relations, profits, variety of goods that have come from interdependence. Anyways, I think we have a great panel here. They've all written articles and books. So if we didn't answer all of your questions in the discussion, please read their work, contact them with further questions. And I appreciate all of you joining us today. And thank you, panelists, for great presentations. We're really grateful for your expertise.
Thank you.